Something that haunted me when I started reading more was just how every philosopher disagreed with one another. You'd think that these people who dedicate their lives to know the truth, to discover the truth, to disseminate the truth, would have more consensus concerning their field, but it was just nauseating and indicative of philosophy not being a real discipline when you have thousands of years of philosophers just plainly disagreeing with one another. But there is a problem with viewing the history of philosophy as just a series of simple disagreements. Such a view gets fixated on the categories of truth and falsity instead of comprehending the diversity of philosophical systems as a sort of progressive unfolding revelation of the one truth. Such an unfolding is known as dialectics. Now, dialectics is usually used as a meaningless buzzword in relation to Hegel. But in this video, I will give an explanation of what it means and why it is used. To start, it is extremely similar to, and even used interchangeably by a few authors, with the words dialogue or discourse, which, with less philosophical connotations, similarly get at the same concept all three are trying to describe. I remember being about 16 and coming across an explanation of dialectics and thinking to myself, well, this all seems true, but I don't understand what the point of it is. And it's quite fitting for our age with such an atomistic and ahistorical understanding of ideas that no wonder I didn't understand the point without the historical context of why it was even conceived as a way of expositing anything at all, in contrast to earlier forms of logic, such as found in Aristotle. So, that being said, we will go into the historical background first. That all being said, dialectics in the classical sense and the sense in which Hegel uses it are very similar. To start, in the classical sense, it was best applied to describe the dialogues of Plato, where his main character, Socrates, would cross-examine his fellow interlocutors, whom, in the early dialogues, would usually assert certain claims of knowledge, only to be scrutinized by Socrates. In later dialogues, Socrates would begin to use his own conceptual toolkit, such as his theory of forms, to provide answers to questions like the immortality of the soul or why to live a good life. What is important here is the method in which Plato wrote, the form of the dialogue, where one interlocutor asserts one claim and is met by scrutiny from Socrates, who asks for an account of why such a claim is. From such scrutiny, the interlocutor further justifies the why of whatever their claim was, usually having to continually abandon and repurpose their original idea for another that gets beyond the first, reaching some higher position of knowledge concerning whatever topic through this back and forth discourse. This process of getting from worse to better is known as alchemy, and it's the basic idea of turning some base metal into gold. But what many miss, especially in the Middle Ages, is that true alchemy is not just with rocks, it's with spirit. And it is this very form of philosophizing in the dialogue format that is radical. Because before Plato, in pre-Socratic philosophy, it was customary for philosophers to simply write some kind of tract or poem explaining what they thought about the world, hence the radicality of putting such people in dialogue with each other. Absurdly, the tradition of writing dialogues ends with Plato, and although a tiny handful of people write dialogues later, they are nowhere near on the scope and eloquence of Plato's. Instead, most of philosophy reverted to a kind of pre-Socratic tract writing of why I am right, most notably with Aristotle, who, to be fair, was held to have dialogues on par with Plato's, with Cicero saying, if Plato's dialogues are silver, then Aristotle's dialogues are gold. But unfortunately, none of these works survived, and what we have left is mostly just probably students' lecture notes. Anyway, to oversimplify for the next few thousand years, philosophy is largely conducted in the same dry style and manner, especially in the medieval era, with about 1,000 years of redefining substance. And of course, there's some notable exceptions. For example, Aquinas actually wrote in a way that was quite similar to the dialogue format, but still no one is as original and as encompassing as Plato in including the whole scene of pre-Socratic philosophers as well as sophists of Greece. That is, it is only when we reach Kant that people are beginning to critique the form in which Kant tried to reconcile the philosophers before him, beginning to critique the form in which philosophy is done. Of course, Kant, in his work, The Critique of Pure Reason, attempted to, as the title indicates, critique reason, with the logic being that the freedom of reason depends on a critique of itself. In other words, that reason must consider its limits, whether it can prove certain things before trying to prove them. Of course, Kant's work was revolutionary in the next phase of philosophy, and part of the influence was had by this massive reaction to Kant. One of the first and most influential critiques of Kant is by Hamann, who had the nickname Magus of the North, and he was actually the very friend of Kant who translated and introduced to him Hume, who is the philosopher Kant said awoke him from his dogmatic slumber. Hamann wrote in his Metacritique of Pure Reason the basic question of asking, how can reason begin to critique itself without first having critiqued itself to know if it could critique itself? Hegel makes a joke out of this, writing that Kant expects us to know how to swim before ever having practiced swimming. And that'll make more sense later. Hamann's main student, Herder, who was influenced by the historian Vico, takes this critique even further, writing that instead of critiquing reason, Kant should have critiqued the process of reasoning in context of language and personality. Suffice to say, what these two critiques are essentially getting at is that the static way of philosophizing, since Aristotle, is insufficient, and that a more dynamic exposition is needed to give an account, a full account of reason. A more dynamic exposition is needed, and this sentence will be very important in a minute. The last major important figure, so that we don't go on these names and histories for so long, is someone named Reinhold, who popularized Kant's philosophy through letters and led its diffusion. In his reworking of Kant, he worked towards a reformation of the methodology in philosophy. The most important principle is that he held that philosophy must be phenomenological. Now, what does that mean? Basically, it just means being historical in respect to the development of thought, or more strictly, the development of consciousness. And of course, that can be on the individual level, from a baby to old age, or on the level of mankind, from primitive times to the Enlightenment. And although there is a small trace of the need for phenomenology in the very tail end of Kant's first critique, Reinhold makes it completely explicit and lays massive stress on it. And it is here we finally reach Hegel, who, deeply considering the just mentioned critiques of Kant, sought to restructure the writing of philosophy back to the same tradition as Plato, except on a total scale, for as he says, the truth is the whole. Where Plato put various pre-Socratic and sophist philosophers together with Socrates in dialogues, Hegel creates a dialogue of all of world history, and that is part of why he's held to be difficult to read, as basically he is retracing every thought that has ever been had in history, from the individual level of sense perception to the world historical level of states and religions. What Hegel does, though, that is different from Plato, is that instead of having characters who hold certain ideas as if in a play, like Socrates or Euthyphro, he rather makes the characters the concepts themselves. Thus, Hegel's understanding of dialectics as the process of various contradictory ideas and concepts coming to terms with themselves. It is the same in life, where you start out with some intuition of how things are, but somewhere along the way, met with some contradiction, you are now forced to square two contradictory realities. Of course, such an understanding may seem banal and obvious, but the full normative scope of what was actually occurring in discourse was not explicated until Hegel. In contrast to classical philosophy, you have many philosophers using the copula. A copula is the word is. When you say blue is a color, you're saying something about blue's nature. The issue is, as said earlier, with some more complex concepts, it's far more difficult to jump straight into what something is. This is actually something that the pre-Socratic Heraclitus found out, hence why he says stuff like, "We walk and do not walk into the same river, for it is not the same man and not the same river." And for this quote, he was accused of breaking the law of non-contradiction. What he was trying to do, but lacked the requisite language to express in 500 BC, was get at a more dynamic way of describing things. This is the beauty that Hegel achieves by creating the narrative of every philosopher, their ideas, and placing them within their grander context in the history of philosophy. Philosophy is the history of philosophy, and it was only when such an individual had access to such breadth of the substance of history books before him laid out on his desk, as well as the leisure time to study, that something like this could have been done. And this is exactly what his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit, or The Coming to Be of Spirit, achieves. Such a narrativization of all of being is understood by him as a pathway of despair, or as the stations on the way to Christ's cross, a way of purgating all of the imperfections in the furnace of human discourse across time. It is the same thing in one's own life, met with some sort of negation, whether that be suffering or something that contradicts our worldview. We are forced to innovate, to adapt in some way that is upbuilding to us. Hegel does not argue for anything in the traditional sort of way, and you'll never find him saying God is X or Y or Z, but rather he walks through the stages of the development of religion and how the latent contradictions sort of play out towards a religion without contradictions, which of course is revealed to be Christianity. The key word here, the key phrase, "the blossom does not refute the bud." In order for the blossom of a flower to sprout, there first must be a stem, and before that, a seed. The blossom may only come about after the stem is present. And of course, in your own life, you have made many mistakes. Yet the point is understanding that each mistake was key in helping you to grow in some way. It is the same in the history of philosophy, where the scattered systems attempting to delineate the truth had to appear as they did, only for the blossom, or the whole of these systems considered as a development of the one true philosophy. And so, what am I saying? Am I saying that the real treasure is just the friends that we've made along the way? Here's a better way to put it, perhaps with one of the best quotes ever written. Hegel writes, "The true is thus the bacchanalian revel, in which no member is not drunk, yet, because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose." In other words, truth is this dialectical interplay. It is the movements. It is a symposium leading and revealing the steps to the essence of something as much as its essence. Thus, why the only people not moving are the ones who consummated their drunkenness, or they have just fully realized movement as well as stasis. And so it's not just the friends that we've made along the way, as that's just one-sided. It is equally the way as much as the end. There is a helpful word, and just one of my favorite words to describe this whole process. In English, it is the word determination. In German, it is Bestimmung, and literally that can be translated as to give voice to. The truth of an object is the discourse, the logos that circumscribes it. And this simple methodology is Hegel's understanding of dialectics. It stands contrary to Kant's categories of understanding, which he thought to be instantly able to cognize or understand the truth of something. Yet, such an account blatantly ignores the genesis of mankind as a species that has created institutions such as language, these institutions that we use to apprehend reality. It is not as if we are just born with as Kant says, these categories of understanding ready-made to apprehend truth. Now, what Hegel does is historicize such categories as something that develop in time, that develop in the discourse of history. Funnily enough, he says the same thing as Plato, that all learning really is just recollection, but instead of being recollection from some transcendent plane that we existed in before birth, it is a recollection of what has already materialized itself in history. It just must be realized as such. It is creating a rational recollective history, or as he says, the owl of Minerva which flies at the coming of dusk. It is in this way, then, that unlike Kant, we cannot just critique reason using uncritiqued reason, or in other words, learn to swim before swimming, but with Hegel, learning to swim as we are swimming. And of course, in that, we must accept that we are going to make many mistakes. It's one of the ironies of dialectics that if one desires something like faith, they must pass through its opposite first, doubt. It is no surprise that some of the most religious people are those who did not grow up with religion, but rather won it for themselves anew, doubting, philosophical or otherwise. In this way, dialectics isn't just a loading bar getting more and more true over time, and this is why there's some reading of him saying that Prussia is the perfection of statehood. That's why this reading is absurd. But rather, it's more akin to a counterintuitive loading bar. And I remember some games where the loading bar would literally just go backwards and jump around until it got to 100%. It's far more akin to that. And also, just note that this isn't an excuse or a way to rationalize to live your life in a certain way, as this sort of method can only be used retrospectively. And Kierkegaard, noticing the same thing, says, life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. You can probably see by now that dialectics or discourse, whatever you'd like to call it, is fundamental to life and really just merely describes the structure according to which reality operates. Another fundamental use of dialectics is in dealing with metaphysical dualism, and everyone knows what this is. It's the basic expression of two. It is yin and yang. It is male and female, or sun and moon, or mind and body. Basically, just dualism. It is it's one of the most primordial expressions of something. And rooted in religions, you can see examples like Manichaeism, Gnosticism, and even Buddhism, which believe that the material world is either illusory or evil, and that the individual must escape such an illusory world through whatever practices of that tradition. Now, what dialectics allows one to do is to conceive how such a dualism may be overcome. For these religions, there is a dualism between the material and the spiritual, between temporal and eternal, between finitude and infinitude. But what Hegel is able to demonstrate with dialectics is that these classical dualisms that are thought of as contradictions are not actually fully contradictory. And although it may sound counterintuitive, here is one example. Something that is truly infinite, such as God, must also be finite. This is because we must ask first, what does infinite mean? It means that there are no limitations. So, if something is only infinite, that is, only a straight line going forever, but not also finite, that is like a circle, Hegel will term this spurious infinity, and this is the kind that is used in math. It's what most people are familiar with. But to scrutinize the concept of infinity further, in being unlimited, in having no limitation, it must not be one-sided. It must not only be infinite. It must inhere its opposite. And this is what Hegel deems the true infinity. Thus, it is the union of the infinite and the finite. And this is something that Christian bishops figured out in theology in the 5th century. It's a doctrine known as the hypostatic union, where Christ is understood to be both God and man in one. It's a clear example where Aristotle would say something like, this is impossible. God and man is like the infinite and the finite in one is a contradiction that violates the law of non-contradiction. Whereas Hegel shows it not to be a contradiction, but rather the union of opposites as both and instead of either or. Then, to reiterate, dialectics is understanding that truth is as much the long and arduous path leading to it, and for us that is the study of philosophical history, as it is the actual final answer. With only the end answer, one is not sufficiently prepared to fully understand such an answer without the purgation of the path leading there. In this way, it is impossible that I, as a 16-year-old looking at the final answer, ever could have understood it. And it's no mistake that this video, in the same way, took the form of walking through the history of dialectics instead of starting straight away with Hegel's understanding. And it's a good thing that most other Hegel videos keep this in mind. But none of them do, of course. It's hilarious because it's literally the first paragraph of the Phenomenology of Spirit where he says it's insufficient to conduct bullet point philosophy, and later that each moment is necessary. It's just very ironic that 90% of videos on YouTube trying to explain Hegel then are just plain erroneous, not employing in their form the very content they speak of in order to peddle some diluted pop understanding, hence the buzzwords. It's all the more dangerous in philosophy, where in other sciences people understand that they're experts, that engineering, that biology, it's not just something everyone with eyes and hands can do, but in philosophy, which is thought of as a free-for-all, it's poison. Funnily enough, Hegel himself predicted what would happen should the final truth be used in the fullness of its buzzwords without any requisite initiation or pathway leading there. As he says, without such articulation, truth lacks universal intelligibility and gives the appearance of being the esoteric possession of a few individuals. An esoteric possession, since it is as yet present only in its concept or in its inwardness. Of a few individuals, since its undiffused manifestation makes its existence something singular. Only what is completely determined is at once exoteric, comprehensible, and capable of being learned and appropriated by all. Only what is completely voiced is another way to translate that. The intelligible form of truth is the way open and equally accessible to all, and consciousness, as it approaches truth, justly demands that it be able to attain to rational knowledge by way of the ordinary understanding. It's quite accurate considering the cultural understanding of Hegel, if you can even really call it that. It's just that he's just some mystical sort of guy using incomprehensible jargon. As he says elsewhere on the topic of diffusing truth, the truth merely saying it is right, uttering a bare assurance of its existence, is equal to any other ideology, to any other idea, making its own bare assurance. The power and strength of the truth lies not in its static being, but in its unfolding movements that it took to get there, consummating itself. Thus, in the same way, it's only productive when you can speak to someone that you never play on your own terms, but rather embody whatever the other person is saying to its next sort of stage, and so on to its final degree. Such a method is termed the immanent critique, and just an easy sort of example is that Socrates uses that all the time. As a final quote, Hegel says, "The force of spirit is only as great as its expression, its depth only as deep as its power to expand and lose itself when spreading and giving out its substance. Thus, why I have made this video." And as a last little message, little note, to the single individual that listens to this video, if this is your first exposure to this kind of way of thinking, you're supposed to not get it fully. You're supposed to misunderstand. Because even this video, unless it was an enormously amount longer than it is now, still fails on its own to fully cover why dialectics are important. And there will be more on that soon. Thank you.